I'm really grateful to moderate the next panel, which is addressing and visioning beyond precarity for the arts. With limited to no resources in public funding for the arts, combined with the ever-increasing growth of IBPOC artists and arts organizations, how will arts organizations and artist service organizations survive and thrive? There's a need to realign core values with shifts and needs within the arts sector. What levels of accountability are needed to support the growth of thriving artists and arts organizations? The two persons I'm going to invite into the conversation, I have the privilege of knowing for many, many years. But actually, I want to credit Gideon Arthurs, whom on a ride on the streetcar, we're both Eastenders in Toronto, we began this conversation. And again, in transparency, Gideon and I are both also on the board for TAPA, Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts, where Jacoba is executive director, and where CPAMO did some instrumental work in their EDI strategies. So I'm inviting them both into the conversation around visioning beyond precarity in the arts. Of course, we'll start with what we think are precarities in the arts, but offer beautiful ways in which we think the sector can begin to think about shifting away from that. Without further ado, I want to invite Jacoba, and of course, bios will be dropped in the chat, into the conversation to give her perspective on addressing and also visioning beyond precarity in the arts. Jacoba.
Thank you, merci, and hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My pronouns are she and her, and when I started in this sector over 40 years ago, we didn't identify with pronouns. We didn't do audio description, and there were a whole bunch of things that we did terribly. And the sector has shifted so much in the time that I have been here. And at TAPA, Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts, we represent at this time 119 professional theater and dance and opera companies. And I've seen so many changes in this just over 2 decades that are related and not related to the pandemic, but something that is undoubtedly changed. Some things will always be the same, like the need for audiences, the need for funding, and the need for space. Those things seem to be forever. But what has changed is the recognition of, I think, inclusivity, the real commitment that people are making to understanding what it means to be genuinely inclusive and building policies within organizations that are committed to EDI in a way that we could not have imagined. I think what's happened is that we're now at this vanguard of embracing, truly embracing this change and promoting this change. That seems to be very authentic within the TAPA membership. Part of our responsibility as an art service organization is to lead with change. And for me, one of the most important ways to do that is through our advocacy work. And the advocacy that we lead at the City of Toronto is through something called Arts Day at the City, when we meet with as many city councillors as we can to drum the drum and walk the walk and make the pitch that arts changes lives. Arts and culture doesn't save lives, but if we're doing our job right, we're changing lives. Part of our argument is always based around supporting and assisting artists through the agencies, the Toronto Arts Council, and making sure that the TAC gets money into your hands, into the hands of arts workers, into the hands of the people who are making a difference. And I believe that municipal politics is the one where we can see the most change happening. It's not supposed to be party politics. It is a little bit, but compared to what's going on federally and provincially, you can see change happen municipally, and we have seen the needle move with funding to the TAC. So that's important because that's helping you as artists create your work, and so that we can hear your stories being told. Because for too long, the diversity of stories has been very narrow and not at all diverse. And now we are seeing that the funders are recognizing that this needs to change as much as society is demanding for it to change. So that's one place where I anchor our work, because we are suffering from a lack of funding and a lack of new pipelines to philanthropic giving and corporate giving. So if we can continue to push for policy at the City of Toronto to support artists, it's an issue where we can see education and address change in that way.
Jacoba, I
I
wanted
have
to
to let
say,
Gideon talk, so I better stop talking.
I have a question for you before entering Gideon into the conversation, and I would love to say with that anchor that you mentioned, what do you feel are some of the misalignments around space and funding for the arts that is causing some of the precarity that we know exists within the arts? Like I could start by saying when I was chair of the working committee for the corporate funding, and looking at some of the ways in which corporations are thinking about funding, as you just mentioned, away from the arts because they're not seeing the impact of the arts in changing lives. What are some of these misalignments for you? Where in your 40 years are you like, you know what? We don't speak about the arts in these particular ways. What are the impact studies that we need to communicate for the arts that would make and that would envision a different way of moving beyond the precarity? Because we always seem to veer towards, oh, we don't have enough funding. We don't have what are some of those misalignments for you that you're seeing?
I'm taking off my jacket now. I'm getting hot. I think part of it is related to our inability. We're storytellers, but perhaps our casting is misaligned. People are less interested in hearing from me, someone who looks like me. I'm an administrator. I'm a person of a certain age. I'm white. I'm not really representing the population of the City of Toronto and what's happening on our stages. Um, we don't have a really good, we don't have any kind of a star system here. And yet we do see that politicians sit up and listen and take notice if you do bring performers in to tell stories. After all, they are the trained and skilled and passionate storytellers who can help make a difference with the residents who live in all the different wards, who live in all the different neighborhoods. If the residents care about the arts, then the councillors will care about the arts because that's who votes for them. There's a misalignment also in our existing spaces that need a great deal of care and watering. And a lot of our spaces are in terrible condition. And I don't want to call any of the spaces out because there are some glorious new spaces as well, like the NIA Center, for example, where you will be live and in person tomorrow. So there are some success stories in the midst of some of our buildings that are dilapidated, that are not up to code. And if you want people to come in and feel welcome, and yet they're not accessible, physically accessible. They're not made to feel welcome because the spaces might be dirty or have leaking roofs. Why in the world would you go back to such a space? Why in the world would you spend $40, $50, $60 on a ticket in a space where you're not physically comfortable?
Thank
So
you.
there's a problem with that as well.
Yeah, I think you've hit some beautiful points around addressing even the demographic changes and how are those new demographics? They're not necessarily new, but how are they now interacting with the arts in a different way? What are their demands? What do they want to see expressed on stages when they arrive in certain organization spaces where they're working with different artists, for example? So I really love that because I think it's an important part in addressing the shifts in the city, where the audiences are, where they're also coming from, how they get. I mean, we have this conversation in the pre-meeting right? How do they get to spaces to experience the arts? And so you're hitting at so many different things around the precarity that the city is also expanded astronomically without actually having planned for it, and how that expansion is also impacting the arts in some beautiful and interesting ways. As I go into inviting Gideon into the conversation, I'm curious about this idea where you mentioned about audiences. Where are they? How are they treated? Because I know Gideon is in charge, quote unquote, in charge of running a space, but also in charge of holding so much within that particular space as it relates to operation. And so Gideon, we were having a conversation around the impact of the organization and also the individual, and the precarity involved in that coming out of COVID, mental health challenges for employees, for artists, for the space itself, how spaces are shifting and changing, and understanding how they also need to navigate differently through into the future. So what are your thoughts on some of these things?
First, hi everybody. Really lovely to be here. Thanks for this invitation. It's great to reflect, stop every once in a while, think about stuff, talk about stuff. It's an important step. A couple different thoughts just first to set the stage in terms of how I've been thinking about precarity in relation to our community. I think that there's a lot of new terminology floating around the polycrisis that we're experiencing right now. We're a world that is experiencing a huge amount of change and very, very quickly. And there's a philosopher called Timothy Morton, who gave me a term that I love, which is called, he talks about environmental philosophy in terms of hyper objects. And hyper objects are these forces of the world that are too large for us to comprehend, but that we we encounter every day. So, global warming could be a hyper object, or all of the styrofoam ever made could be a hyper object. These are things that we deal with all the time. And yet they're just too big for us to understand. And I think that in times where we don't understand things, if you would follow the metaphor a little bit, it's like being surrounded 360 degrees by giant CN towers. I mean, you just can't see the top of these things, and you get vertigo. These are times where the pace of change and the scale of the challenges that we're facing give us incredible vertigo. And as a result, many people turn to a fixed point in the ground that will give them a simple answer and a simple way forward. I think that's why we have seen a rise of far-right politics in the world, because people are desperate to understand what's around them. They're desperate to blame someone else for what's going on. They're desperate to come up with easy solutions. And I really think that this is the crisis that we're living right now. And I think that this kind of the precarity gets deeper and deeper the further away from the center you get. So if you're an artist already working on the margins of society, your precarity is amplified. And if you're an IBPOC artist working on the margins of the margins, then obviously you are facing existential precarity, and that's a real threat for us, for so many reasons, because we endanger our cultural heritage that way, right? The artists who should be telling our stories, the stories we want to be talking about right now, don't have the opportunity to do so. And I would suggest that the sort of the unequal application of precarity to IBPOC artists and to emerging artists is a huge loss from a sector, like an economic point of view. I'm going to make a really crass argument to say that Toronto is Toronto. And the only way forward for arts organizations in Toronto today is going to be deeply engaged with the many communities that make up what Toronto is now, and tell stories in ways that resonate with those communities, tell stories through the bodies of people that are living those experiences. All of the values work aside, and the values are central to everything I do in my life. But all of the values aside, the proposition for the future of the arts in Toronto, at least, and I think in the world, is going to be an authenticity of storytelling to groups of people who have never identified with our institutions. And
so Gideon,
yeah,
if you're going to engage those communities and you want to get those communities involved, and I agree with you 100%, how do you propose to do that?
The key word I use is authenticity, first of all.
Yeah.
I'll give the example of Soul Pepper. We are who we are. Some of you will know the story of Soul Pepper. This organization was very much founded on an old white patronage model. So the company was underwritten by a very small number of very wealthy, powerful families in Toronto. The company exploded or imploded, however you want to call it, in 2018 with a leadership change. And then, of course, the pandemic came and affected us. And we found ourselves coming out of the pandemic essentially with none of what the company was built on. So none of those big donors were still around. Our audiences had aged out. They were very anxious about the fact that we have a woman of color as our artistic director. And we had to basically start building from zero, which was a real let's call it a test of my convictions. It's a project I've always wanted to undertake, but never had to before. And we did a few things. The first is, and it took us time to learn, the first is we invited creators into the circle. And so Winnie Mangesha, who's our artistic director, set our North Star as a concept of radical inclusion. And that North Star now defines everything we do, from governance to fundraising to programming. It is infused into the fundamental nature of this company. So when we hire somebody, when we pick a play to put on, the first filter we put on it is, does this tell the story of who we are and what the city is? The second piece is we have had to totally demystify and make way less precious what it feels like to experience our company. So where in the past you would have to know what time to show up, you'd have to wear a very specific outfit, you'd have to pay a very specific ticket price. We have not only busted open the experience of going to see plays, where you can now get in for free, there's lots of cheap options, there's lots of different kinds of access points, but we also run essentially programming all day long that's designed to connect with people around us. We're in a neighborhood where 50,000 people will be moving in the next 10 years. They are really demographically representative of what Toronto is. So we do things like a movie night once a month for free, and 200 or 300 people come out and watch a movie and drink beer. We are going to be offering yoga classes in the morning. We do a book club. We do wardrobe sales for our surplus costumes. Anything to bring people back into the orbit of each other and to feel like a community again at any access point possible, whether you're a kid, a senior, person who wants to buy a ticket or not. I'll give you one example and then I'll stop talking. But one of the things that this sounds like a stupid thing, but one of the things that we observed is where we are in the Distillery District is the turnaround for the streetcar, the TTC, the King Car. And we have the great fortune of being the toilet for the streetcar drivers, because they come to the turnaround and they have to go pee. And so they come into the Young Center and they use our bathroom. And so we had this volume of TTC drivers who are coming through our building. And first we engaged them by talking to them about buying a cup of coffee. And then we started to engage them by putting together a little lunch special for them. And now when you're a TTC driver, you come in and you get a special membership card, TTC membership card, that gives you extra access to all of our family programming. And they've started to know who we are, and they're coming in, they're checking out the installation art that we put in our lobby, and they become an active member of the community. And when we did Doors Open Toronto just last weekend, we enlisted the TTC drivers to give a special announcement at the end of the King line to come in and go and see Soul Pepper, because it was great, which they did. So I just want to give that as an example of ways in which we are called to be active participants in rebuilding the bonds of civic affection that have been so screwed up lately. And that to me is the opposite of what we used to do in terms of saying, if you look like this and you can pay this much, you can come into our space. And now, we're trying to find a counterpoint to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I want to go back, Gideon. You've proposed something really beautiful. It's this idea of like hyper objects. And I asked the question to the chat, and I'm inviting anyone on the Zoom to put what you consider are hyper objects in the arts into the conversation in the chat. Someone mentioned showtimes at 8 p.m. as a hyper object because of aging populations, because of different needs. And I can only imagine that visioning beyond precarity would be, again, variety in showtimes. One of the things, as I run a dance company, one of the things we did this year for the first time was actually offer a matinee performance on a Sunday, which was highly successful in some ways as the first offering of shifting that sort of hyper object of like the colonial model, 8 o'clock the showtime or 7:30, and it starts that time. And, because we're seeing that also it impacts people, how they get home, when they get home, how they arrive in the space to actually interact with spaces. I see another comment in the chat around communicating to communities as a hyper object, because maybe we're using the same communication throughout all the varying communities in Toronto in the arts. And so I wonder around my marketing hat would go for something in addressing that as a precarity. How do we begin to diversely think about those taglines and how we communicate to different communities in the arts? How are those demographics within those communities different? And can we begin as organizations or artists to begin to think through that piece at the beginning of an idea or in an ideation phase? What are some of your thoughts on that? Jacoba and Gideon.
I have two that I want to throw in. Oh, so you go ahead, Jacoba.
Yeah, I am. One of the things that we do at B Street, we've got a new space, and one of the things that we are trying to do to support the sector and the artists is we have an indie caucus that gathers on the last Monday of every month. Anyone can come in. It's a non-transactional space. We actually sometimes, have a guest speaker. Generator spoke recently because they have a tremendous amount of resources that they've created that are online that help independent art makers learn how to publicize their show, get some information, basic 101, really important financial literacy on everything from how to write a grant application to how to do cash flow to how to budget a show. But we've also just invited people to come and explore the studio spaces because we have a recording studio, and not to be intimidated by the equipment and not to feel a financial barrier to engaging in it. We also provide free pizza and free beer. So that helps sort of flatten the line. I love it when people eat together. Something I learned from a friend of mine, who some of you may know, Franco Boni, who worked for many years and still works in this sector. But his passion about bringing food and people together as the great equalizer. And I do believe there's a real fundamental truth to that. As much as music brings people together, so does food. And sharing food is one of the most sacred things that we can do with each other. It's an act of pure generosity. And I love the theater center continues to have those community meals together. It's another example of opening up and unlocking doors for people to come together, to share a meal, to share their thoughts. I do think there is an awareness and an understanding of the challenges as well that people are facing with getting around. It's impossible to get around the city. It's really a challenge. And not everybody is a cyclist. Not everybody drives a car. And not everybody, quite frankly, feels comfortable on the TTC. I don't think we have the answer to this. I don't think we've unlocked it, not even close. And it is an issue, not only the time of the performance that somebody put in, but how do I get to that performance? And that is something that the city should be working together with us. Somebody was talking about providing a bus. I know that some of the people who are the Guild Festival producing Shakespeare on the outskirts of town, they're considering a bus to help their patrons get to them. This is not such a radical idea. Why aren't we helping our audiences if we are having such a hard time securing and harnessing those audiences? Let's ask them, what do you need to get here? Beyond the ticket price, what are the other barriers? And certainly one of them is getting around the city.
Before you jump in there, Gideon, I just want to make sure that I honor that beautiful question, Jacoba, around asking audiences what their challenges are. So I think that's the iterative part of it, right? That's the way of addressing and moving beyond some of those precarities. And I think that's a beautiful way of also including audiences into something that we've taken for granted, that they will always be there, they will always show up. What also comes from that particular statement is how many of us in arts organizations or in our practice actually make statements about alternative routes to get to our spaces? Because they as audience members may only know one route, but it may not be the most efficient route. Maybe there's another route to get to some of the spaces in which these things occur. And so I want to just highlight that as well. Not even
and what about carpooling? Why not carpool an audience? These are the kind of things we really need to consider and think about, right?
Gideon.
Yeah, I would add a little yes and to Jacoba's question, because I think that the transition that we're seeing in our sector is really fascinating, where and Kevin, you said it really well. We used to take for granted that our audiences would show up. And the argument used to be that art was important because art is important, and because artists say that it is important. And so we all know it's the broccoli that you need to be a more cultured person is art, and therefore you should buy the ticket and make the donation and get stuck in traffic and show up when we tell you to, and sit in silence and follow the rules. And I really believe that we have to move from a model where the intrinsic value of what we do is assumed, and understand the extrinsic value. The question that I want to ask our audiences is, what is valuable about this space for you? What is valuable about this experience for you? If it's not valuable, why not? Why can't I create a space and an experience and a piece of work that really means something to you? And we're working hard on it, but if I walked right outside my door right now, 9 out of 10 people that I encountered in the street would not know that there was a theater right behind me. And so it indicates that we not only have done a bad job on the messaging front, but that we have done a really, really bad job of authentically providing value to our community. And so until we do that, we'll never get out of this scarcity mindset, because people will never invest in us, right? If we get cut, nobody cares. If we shut down, nobody cares. If a theater in Forest falls over, who's going to be there to hear it? And I think that is a journey that we have to get on fast, is figuring out how do we provide value in the context of all this insanity that we're living right now. How do we provide that value? I want to offer one place where I think we offer a lot of value, but there's so many. I've been sort of, one of my other obsessions in life is fighting the internet. I hate the internet, and I was listening to something. I've had these thoughts for a long time, but I was listening to somebody who expressed that the current economy of the world relies on the fracking of our attention. The fracking being the worst possible, the most violent kind of extraction possible. All of the biggest companies in the world rely on our inner landscapes to extract profit. We give them our memories, we give them our anger, we give them our creativity, we give them our time, they give them our lust. We give all of the biggest companies in the world right now this inner resource. And I think that the one thing that we can say about the arts and the live performing arts is that it is a counterpoint to that fracking. We are a movement for the preservation of the human spirit. And we have to find ways to be the place where, just maybe because they bumped shoulders with somebody or had a laugh at the same time as someone else, or made eye contact over the room when something interesting was happening on stage with somebody, that we are reminded of the complexity, the nuance, the awesomeness of our inner landscapes, and that we resist this fracking. I think there's a lot of other arguments, but in terms of how we change our marketing, the message I'm really propelling forward is, come and save your soul, essentially, and going from there.
Gideon, I was in Seattle for a conference. I need to share this with you because, and with everyone, there is a park, of course, in Seattle, which is, you know, the home of so much online activity, Wi-Fi free zone. And they had cast a net over this park. You couldn't be online. You had to look at each other. You had to look at the trees. You had to listen to the birds. You had to look at the sky. It was a very human place, and it was packed in the Wi-Fi free zone. Not free Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi free. So there is a movement. There is a movement that's moving there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I think so many organizations and artists is in this space with the online space, the Instagram space, the spaces that are actually hyper aware and hyper sort of representing the work that we do that sometimes takes time. I would offer the yes and is, how do we begin to unpack that as an important part of the work that we do as artists? Because I now realize that if we're thinking about a future generation, part of the precarity and addressing how we move and move beyond it is we have to begin to work with it, because the future generations of consumers of the arts and the practices that we do are so in tune to those things. What are some of the things that we can do, is the question I have for both of you where that is concerned, because I think it's unfortunately shifting the way we are working within the arts itself.
And we have a really tricky issue, is that to make art, we require three incredibly expensive things, which is space, time, and people. So there's no automation in the way that creativity happens. And then on the counterpoint, there's a demand for instant everything all the time, and a kind of inner access that the internet gives you the feeling of. Those contradictions are really hard to balance. I think a lot of what we've already touched on is the beginnings of how we address that. I mean, this is not so much artistic practice, but if we can inspire ourselves by the silent global majority and the way that they consume culture. Culture doesn't exist in a clean white box or black box in a room with air conditioning. It is a dynamic, living, breathing thing that can happen on the street. It can happen at night. It can happen daytime. It can happen because of a busker. It can happen because of a fully mounted version of an epic play. But if we can think about what we do as let's call it as an experience instead of fixed product, and kind of free ourselves from all of the modalities that we've had in the past of how you're supposed to experience us, I feel like that's the beginning of that. So come on in. It happens at 8 a.m. It's a thing, but it's little, it might be big, I think, you don't have to get dressed up. You don't have to pay the big bucks. It can be for 10 minutes, but we just have to give as many entry points as possible and just get it out of our uptight version of what the experience of seeing art is in North America.
And yes. I'm going to jump in on that and build on that, in that, yeah, come on in, try it out. Part of that is related, of course, to removing a financial barrier, but I also feel like age is a barrier. And I feel like it's not just for adults. I feel like families need to be welcomed into spaces, all ages, all demographics throughout the city. If we're really going to invest in communities, which is something that, Gideon, you mentioned earlier in this conversation, then let's open the tent and let's welcome everybody into that tent. Even in restaurants, I don't eat in them very often. I prefer to eat comfortably in my own home. I like preparing food, but in restaurants, you don't see children very often. Children are kind of not welcome in restaurants. Families are not invited into communal spaces unless it's advertised and marketed as family friendly. Now, sometimes the content might be an issue, and I recognize that the storytelling perhaps can be a barrier to families, but I feel we really need to start with that younger generation, building on what you said, Kevin, and looking towards the future, we need to build and include them and not exclude either the elderly, but also very importantly, the younger people that are bubbling up who are curious. They have curiosity. It's such a gift. It's so much joy. They are so curious about everything, but they run into these walls and they're not welcome. I think we need to change that.
Yeah, and I'm agreeing because I think that's where the inclusive framework comes in, right? Again, I think it's part of the misassumption we've had that the audiences will come and they will look a certain way, they will be a certain age. And so if we begin to think about addressing it, I would argue thinking as diversely as possible in our engagements. What is it in a performance? What is the younger people engagement? What is the youth engagement? What is the older population engagement? What is the seniors or older adults engagement within that same show or within that same thing? And then how we can, as Gideon mentioned, begin to also use the online space as a way of engaging them. You know, it's funny she mentioned food, because I think it's an interesting thing to have artists in a space where food is and people are, and talk about work, talk about the work they're in that may arrive in a formal presentation space, but may also arrive in an online space, in a live, in an Instagram live. So I think there's a lot of unpacking as a potential for the arts sector moving forward about how we engage and use these particular things around us, and also the time we're in as an important part of shifting the from precarity. I want to go back to something Gideon had mentioned, and we were talking about, which is the impact of the precarity on the employees within arts organization or on artists themselves, right? The financial precarity. What are some of the ways you are seeing this impact of coming out of the pandemic, the shift in artists leaving the sector, et cetera, on individuals, but also on your organizations as they exist? And what are some of the ways in which you're thinking through those pieces differently? It's
very hard. It's a hard time for so many of us. It's a hard time for organizations and communities. I've kind of two competing thoughts I want to get out. One of them is there's been a huge flight of folks who are deciding that they just can't handle the pressures. And I think that we've got a kind of perfect storm where younger employees don't want to come into the workforce because they know how precarious and undervalued they will be and how hard the work is. And then we have people who've spent their lives accruing talent and capacity and knowledge, and they're leaving quickly as well because they haven't maybe just one more chance to go do something that'll be more sustainable retirement for them. And we have no retirement models whatsoever in our sector. So it's a sort of infinite amount of work that has to go on all the time. And we're doing that with less and less resources. I think that there's a lot we have to talk about in terms of the struggles, not the struggles. Their organizations are the repositories of the best and the worst of us. So in terms of the moments of reckoning that we've been experiencing over the past few years, it is 100% true that arts organizations, like all other kind of structures that we've built, have systemic fundamental issues that have excluded people, that have perpetuated violence on people. These things are true. And I would argue that organizations are that. They are an organization of human beings getting together to try to do something together. And we've lost faith or trust in the notion of an organization. And one of the ways that we do that is that we think that there's some kind of ghost structure within the organization that is making decisions based on, any bias, anti-artist bias, or an not wanting to upset donors, or we project a lot of the anxieties we have on the world into organizations. And I sometimes wish for us, as well as an arts community, that we recognize that even our biggest institutions in the arts are essentially small fry compared to late stage capitalist organizations that are trying to destroy our souls, and that the notion that a company with $4 or $5 million or 3 million or 1 million or not a million or 10 million is the fundamental evil in the world is something that I think that we have to move beyond. I think what we have to find is ways in which people and the resources that organizations can accrue can kind of find a path forward together, much more unified as an opposing force to these other much bigger hyper objects that are shaping our lives. So retention and keeping people working in the sector, helping them learn, helping, I'll just give the example of us. We've had big financial woes over the past few years. Our building is costing us 60% more than it did 4 years ago. And I currently have 3 full-time jobs at Soulpepper, and I took a massive pay cut this year to help our budget balance. So I recognize my privilege having a full-time job, making the money I do, and this is precarity.
Mm-hmm. What's beautiful there, Gideon, is not just transparency, but this idea that even within our organizations, even as artists, curators, whoever we are with our titles, we're impacted by society. We're impacted by larger systems for which we are actually still living and enacting with, that has a historical bias and a historical weight to it in its own right. And so thank you for acknowledging that, because I think it impacts how organizations functions. It impacts how people within organizations functions. But I think there is something beautiful that you're suggesting about organized systems. And those systems are whatever within an organization that can actually support those working within the organizations. And I think there's an interesting dynamics and a balance there between those two things as we operate and work and function within arts organizations as well. And so I want to just honor that thought, and that it's based on something that's very capitalist, that says these are revenue generation streams, this is what income looks like, this is what funding looks like, these are what, and that's what I like to say for so many, that all art is political. Because if I receive funding as an IBPOC organization, it means that there's another organization or a fund of art or a series of artists that did not. And so how can I begin to, with my organization of system, begin to provide networks of support for the others that may also alleviate their precarity within the sector itself? So thanks for mentioning those things. Jacoba, any thoughts?
I think there needs to be support, as was mentioned, around education. I think it's a huge part in terms of training, and I prefer to use the word retraining, because I think that the existing systems are not working. They are clearly not addressing some of the issues that are generational. And I think that we need to look at new models, throw out the old models. Part of the lost faith and trust is because of the erosion of those old models. And new business models need to be incubated. New business models need to be supported, so that genuine change can happen. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the mid-level people coming in are just going to be trained in the same way. That's why I feel like retraining is critical. There is such precarity right now, not just in arts and culture, in every single sector. The tension between work-life balance and hybrid working models and remote working models. It doesn't matter whether or not you're an arts worker. It's in every single part of our sector right now. The downtown core remains empty. There's a huge issue with empty, buildings, and yet people can't afford to rent because there's no space. We need to break it open. We need to crack it wide open and stretch our goals completely differently, because we have the space, but we are not locking our way around the whole solution that is there. It exists. I also feel really, really strongly around the lack of a retirement plan. I have recently announced I'm leaving TAPA, and once or twice, not very many times, people were like, "Are you going to go? Are you getting ready to go?" And it's like, I couldn't afford to go. I could not afford to leave, and that's a serious issue in our sector. It's not about hitting a glass ceiling; it's about your feet being stuck on the floor, and the financial precarity, not only the mental health precarity, not only the HR precarity, but the financial precarity of not being able to exit is a very real thing, right? So that's, again, I'm putting the question out there. Don't have the solution, but a big part of it would be if we could rally around reforms around employment insurance, if we could rally around and support on a federal level and continue to ask politicians for equitable pay across the board, like what we saw happen a little bit during the pandemic, and that kind of funding that came in that was life-changing for so many people. All of a sudden, they weren't being treated like a second-class citizen anymore, and they were able to live as an artist. For the first time in their lives, I spoke to people who were like, "Oh my goodness, I'm living at a different level that I have never experienced in my life before." So again, I'm going back to politics and advocacy work, but we do need to advocate for that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that voice. You mentioned education, and I remember in our pre-meeting having the conversation around where do the artists find themselves in that education, that they too have a voice, that they can actually lobby behind organizations that may pay them to make those particular statements. So that way we're actually working collectively as a sector to move the needle forward. That it's not at all a transactional relationship for my very small dance company. When you sign a contract for a particular project that says you were paid this much of money, that comes from someone writing a grant. That comes from the visual presence I have in advocacy. That comes from my board engagement in other spaces. That comes from everyone actually advocating for the better well-being, so we can actually be able to move beyond precarity and work with in a more supportive sector. That includes care for the artists, that includes care for the executive directors and those in the leadership positions, where we know sometimes it's always an expectation that we offer to our employees and our artists the things, but they don't offer anything back to us. So I think there's a whole lot of things that we need to do to address this idea about how we move beyond this precarity, that is more about nurturing the well-being of the sector, because it impacts everyone. So thank you so much for that. Is there any questions from any of the participants? Any comments at this point in the conversation? I don't like calling these panels anymore. It's a conversation, and these are not like panelists. We're speakers. We're having a conversation. So I'm inviting anyone. Any thoughts you want to place in the chat? As people, we do need to drink some water sometime and take a little breathe and a breath. And I refuse to pretend like I'm a robot. So let me call
basic income guarantee was what I was looking for when I was talking about, reforms to EI.
Yeah.
Never letting go of that one.
Yeah. I think it's really important because also in the sector, we've been allowing ourselves, even as arts organizations, to be on the periphery of the conversation rather than in the center of the conversation about where the arts exist within the well-being of tax-paying Canadians, where we are then an important conduit to that particular understanding. Both for new immigrants coming in, both for persons who have been here for a very long time, both for what it means for Canadians to think about culture as an important way for benefiting their entire well-being, and through their participation, through their philanthropy, through their fundraising, through their engagement with the arts. And I think so that's a larger piece I would offer in the many hats we all wear to the conversation. Yes, Jacoba.
Well, I didn't have my hand up, but if you're giving me the microphone, I'm glad to take it. What I do want to, talk about the balance of live workspace and affordable live workspace. Not only can we not get around the city, we can't afford to live in the city. And I feel like the city is hugely under pressure to produce these results. And this is one of those things, going back to community, where we can do this together. And they want to hear from the storytellers. They want to hear from the artists. And so I think the onus is on us to galvanize our community, to come forward and to help us express our stories. We need to do that better.
I agree. Gideon, any thoughts? I have a question from the chat.
Just a very small addition to that, which is again to emphasize that as a community, we haven't, even our storytellers haven't done a good job of telling the story of why our sector is important. And I think that one of the reasons is because we've been living in this precarious space for so long, we turn towards self-affirmation as the ultimate way of recognizing, why the work that we do is important, because it's been a struggle to get audiences, because it's been a struggle to be heard in the noise of the internet, because of all those things, we tend to say, oh, we're important because we told each other that we're important. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, and I think large organizations have a responsibility to do this, is without instrumentalizing what we do, we need to find a way of reframing it so that we are clear about why we make a difference in the world. And it's not, we don't make a difference in the world because our plays are good. That's how we understand it. We make a difference in the world because we make healthier communities, because we change learning outcomes, because we help people, and again, there's ways to talk about that without instrumentalizing it and saying, oh, we improve property value. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the important function that we should and could and do play in the social sector in terms of the health of our communities. And if we're willing to do that, I think we get a better chance at advocating for ourselves with government, who don't really understand the peculiar weirdness of our sector. And what we hear from the government all the time is when we talk to the arts sector, they never know what they want. They're split on everything. The dancers are fighting the theater makers, who are fighting the musicians, who are fighting and we kind of need to essentialize that a little bit and tell a stronger story about the work that we do in community.
Thank you for that. There's a question here we want to throw into the conversation, but I have a story that actually it'll be my memoirs. And it was actually this idea around community, right? Community engagement. When I was the dance animator at the Living Arts Center, one of the main things that we say, oh, we need to get back in community. And I go, well, where are we? Are we not in a community? Are we not? There's huge condos around, like, which community do we need to get back into? We are in a community. So that idea of like shifting where community engagement happens, because our spaces or organizations are in those communities. And then also this idea around the experiential. We have to, I think as a sector, begin to make sure that politicians experience the impact of the things that we do. And I remember one year in that particular position as a dance animator, they were going to present the budget to the city. And then Hazel McCallion was the mayor. And I said, well, let's do a flash mob and present, and like everyone, the ED, the director of departments, the persons in the dance, we all learned this flash mob and presented the budget, and then made a statement as to why we had to increase the budget. But what happened in that moment is that they were able, as city councilors sitting there in their suit and tie to go, oh, we'll make a decision. They were able to experience what we were actually advocating for. So I think it's important that when we speak to politicians, that in addressing the precarity, we begin to actually infuse those conversations with not just the qualitative and quantitative, but also with the actual experiential components involved in the work that we do as creators. And that I feel is maybe a missing link in some of the ways that we are approaching moving beyond the precarity and getting some more traction for the work that we do as artists and in the art sector.
I love flash mobs. That's a good story.
Yeah. I thought. Thank you. There's something for having people move or sing or write or create, and actually the numbers in a budget becomes the numbers you can dance to. There's so many beautiful ways. I think everyone in society actually has an experience with the arts, but because of professionalism, because of society, we move away from it. And so how do we move back to that idea of what were your first experiences in the arts as we think about moving beyond precarity is an important part. The question that Jennifer posted in the chat was, let's go back. I'm going back a little bit here. Was we're all struggling and stressed, and it's a vicious cycle. So in that state, how do we work to care and support others when we live in a state of precarity? And what are some examples that you have, maybe through your organizations, where you're looking at supporting and caring for others within your organizations and the sector itself?
I'm going to put on a very organizational hat and just offer up one example, and then over to you, Jacoba. One of the reasons I love organizations is it does allow you to kind of pool resources and work on something collectively. One of the things that we've been working on at Soulpepper is we put in place a well-being fund that right now is primarily available to or it's only available to the artists that we hire on short-term contracts. And essentially, although we'd like it to be much, much bigger, it's a no questions asked compassion fund. If you have any mitigating circumstance in your life, like you have a child that needs to, childcare, or you have a parent who needs to be put on wheel trans, or whatever it is, we offer as best as we can stipend to help you with whatever it is that your life is requiring. So that amount is growing and growing. One of the interesting things about that program, our Wellbeing Fund, is that we sort of thought that we would be carrying it on our own. And when we put it out in the world and talked to one of our longstanding corporate sponsors, they decided that that's where they wanted to put their dollars. It was actually that they thought the most impact that they could make was to support that Wellbeing Fund. And it's actually, so in a lot of ways, it's become not a revenue generating, but a much more manageable program that's allowed us to go a lot further. So I think that kind of the ability to try to find novel approaches to collecting resources is something we actually are really good at it as a community. And I think that care, we've got to break out of the mold where care is one person's thing and one person's thing. Care is the village, is our village, and we have to find ways to pull those resources together to first lift up the most precarious, the most in danger, the most in need, and then the whole sector, because we're, as I say, we're all on this scale where we're way below anybody else in the world who's got a pension and a big paycheck and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you for that. What's interesting is one of my things I need to get back to is I really want to have a AD in dance meetup once a month where you have 15, it's an hour maybe, we have 15 minutes where we vent and go on and on. Mm-hmm. And then we have 45 minutes where we literally just have food and just talk about some of the other aspects of things that we know we could support each other on. And it's still in my mind, and I'm putting it back into the universe because I want to make it happen. Nova Bhattacharya and I have been talking about it for about 3, 4, 5 years now, and want to get back to that because I think it's just important to get together in space and share.
Come do it at our building, Kevin, anytime.
Okay, we see partnership.
No, come do it at B Street. Don't go there. Come to B Street. Don't go
and
to
Manuel is going to come in and say, no, come to Kent Stage. Well, I know I have 3 spaces where we can all rotate and shift and possibly have that for the sector in Toronto. But yes, thank you. Any other examples, Jacoba, on your end?
Yeah, one of the things that we do, and this has come as a real success story is a partnership with CAMH. And again, it's identifying the right partner and offering free mental health workshops. And they are over a lunch hour. So they're not forcing people to sacrifice their workday, which we heard from people is too difficult. They can't take the time out of their working hours. And they're really well attended, and there's no barrier because of a grant that we got. So these CAMH mental health workshops are, a series of lunch and learns, for lack of a better sort of marketing tag around them, but they're not really learning. They're creating a new community where what we've seen evolve is people are now talking to each other outside of the CAMH workshops. That's fantastic. That's the community building themselves and their own time, because of the question around the stress and the enormous weight, the enormous burden. I think that people feel alone. And I think gathering people together, that's one of our jobs as an art service organization, is to create opportunities for people to gather together, so that they're not alone. And we do have community meetings for general managers of indie companies, and they are indie non-venued companies. They're pretty intense. And we started doing them, exclusively on Zoom. The desire came from the group. We want to do this in person. And trust is built in person very differently than it is on Zoom. And the conversations have become very rich in person now, where people, I think, have actually come. One particular team of GMs has started collaborating on something that is towards problem solving, which is great. So, yeah, those are two examples that I can offer.
And thank you for those. I think it's a beautiful. This is the generative space that I absolutely enjoy and love. I'm like, okay, how do I begin to plan or talk about these things? Because I think if you go back to the main focus of the conversation, I'm getting excited. So I'm talking fast. I'm going to slow down. I'm getting excited. If we go back to the main crux of the conversation, how do we move beyond? I think we have to address that we've been taught to compete against each other as organizations in the sector. And this is a counter revolution to actually how do we work and network within the sector as we begin to move beyond the precarity. I like to say a lot as we end the session around, as artists or as arts organizations, we have more resources than we choose to use. And so I'm always curious about the human capacity as a resource. And what does networking look like as a resource? Rather than, funding to do that, what small gestures and actions we can do to begin to bring the community together to actually move beyond this really, really ridiculous mindset of scarcity and precarity towards the potential of the things that we know we have, which is our networks and partnerships and resources. As we end, I'm just going to open it up for final thoughts from you, Gideon, and also from Jacoba.
I think you've just given the final thoughts. I think that's really well said. The only thought I will share is something that I try to say to myself pretty much every morning. It's been an enormous struggle for the past year or so to come to work focused and excited and happy because the troubles are real. But I take great strength from the notion that after the forest fire, there's new growth. And I think that a lot of what we have wanted to change for a long time is now able to change because that's where we're at. We've had the forest fire, and it is the foundation for new growth. And I'm really excited to see what that means for all of us.
Thank you, Gideon. Jacoba.
I think we are at a precipice of change. I think we are at a tipping point that is making genuine space for the next generation. I think voices are having the courage and the trust to be heard. And so in the time of the precarity and in the time of the stress, I'm an eternal optimist. I have to be, otherwise I could not function because it's so dark. And so because of that, I believe this is a great time. In spite of all of these terrible challenges that we're facing globally right now, this is a time for us to rise up and for all our voices to be heard, because it feels possible.
Thank you for the optimism. I think I've been realizing, if we look at global culture, every 50 years there's a huge upturn, a huge shift, and we're at that point. And I think there's something beautiful for the optimism, and also the foresight, the perspective shift to move us into the future. So I want to offer that as an end that change is incremental and requires small, bold actions towards an inclusive future for the arts. With that, I want to say thank you to everyone who shared. I want to also make note that there is also conversations happening in the chat around beginning to think about disabilities representation in the arts, and also accessibility for consumers, for employees, for the many ways that we can begin to think about the inclusive framework within the sector. And I want to also end by also saying that if you wear opticals, it's a disability, because we base it on 2020. And I, who wear opticals, who also has a photosensitivity, must begin to think through those particular pieces as we do with audiences. It's about some of the ways we can shift the sector moving forward, to really make sure that everybody feels welcome and inclusive for that, that creative future. Thank you so much, Gideon and Jacoba, my dear colleagues at TAPA, but also in the art sector, for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.